Hi, I'm Kate Sussman. I'm Associate Dean of the Faculty. I'm also a professor in the Biology Department and the Neuroscience and Behavior Program. I'm really excited today to share with you some of the recent research that my students and I have been doing with a very tiny nematode creature, or a tiny worm. These studies that I'm going to tell you about today are 3 stories about pesticides and microplastics' effects on nematode health. And these research projects span the globe, including collaborators I have on campus in Italy, at the University of Prague, and in Shanghai, China. Pesticides are used globally, and they're very particularly used heavily in areas of agriculture all across our country, from coast to coast, really concentrated in the breadbasket of the United States, California, and also the eastern seaboard, where there's high agricultural productivity. But we also use pesticides in managing forests and also in managing our lawns. Many of us, although not me, are very interested in having that perfect green lawn without any kind of pests or insects. Pesticides are often applied as aerosols, either sprayed or dropped from planes. And these pesticide residues can actually evaporate up into the clouds, be transported by global air currents, and deposited or rained down in other places of the world. And so it turns out that pesticides that we use, let's say in Michigan, end up in the tissues of Arctic sea mammals. So really, pesticides are all over the place. Why are we worried about them? It turns out that pesticides that are in our soil can be taken up by the roots of plants, can appear into the fruits and the vegetables that we eat, even if we wash them off, can be ingested by soil organisms, by their predators, birds, by their predators, top predatory birds, by people and our own offspring. And so it's really of interest to us to understand what these pesticides do to our organisms that we share the planet with, as well as each other. It turns out if you're an agricultural worker, let's say, and you apply heavy doses of pesticides to your fields, you can, if you don't have the protective equipment, you can be exposed to some very high doses of pesticides. This can lead to nausea, headache, rashes that can be really quite bad. Over a long period of time, this can lead to immunosuppression. If you're male, a low sperm count, carcinogenesis, paralysis, chemical burns, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and even death. So they're not good, right, in high doses. But what about the kinds of doses that you and I are exposed to, or soil organisms are exposed to, very low doses that are effective on the pests? It turns out that even low doses accumulating over time can have effects like suppression of your immune system, or they've been linked to the development of leukemia, particularly in children, attention and behavioral deficit disorders, particularly in children, as well as a number of allergies and asthma. So these pesticides are really, we inhabit the world with them, and it's really important for us to understand how they come to have these effects, which can really affect our health and our longevity. What's even more sort of pressing these days is that we don't just apply one pesticide. We use upwards of hundreds of pesticides, and they all run off, or they get carried in the air, or they end up in the soil in these complex mixtures. We really don't even know what mixtures of pesticides do to us and the organisms that we share the planet with. But what you can see in this slide is that these mixtures have been linked to gross deformities in organisms in waterways. For example, frogs that have weird numbered legs, or fish that are bent in their bone growth is stunted, or honeybees that can't find their way back to their nest from the fields that they're pollinating. And so there are very strange effects that seem to affect development, seem to affect reproduction, seem to affect behaviors. So in my lab, we're looking at the effects of these kinds of mixtures using a model organism, a tiny nematode worm called Caenorhabditis elegans, which is a mouthful. So I'm going to just call them worms or C. elegans. These are free-living, transparent, really quite elegant worms that inhabit the soil as free-living creatures. These are found in your compost if you compost in your gardens. They have about 1,000 cells. 300 of those 1,000 are nerve cells, and that's kind of where I am particularly interested in effects on behavior. And what you can see in this video, I'm going to show right now, is we can look at the individual cells in these nematodes and we can watch them divide and divide again and divide again until they grow up into an adult nematode. We can expose these nematodes for different periods of time, for the whole lifespan to look at developmental effects, for their entire adulthood to look at behavioral and reproductive effects. And so this slide shows the pathway in which we would be testing and looking at egg laying, locomotion, lifespan, development, and neural function. So short story one, how do pesticides affect nematode behavior? So in this set of experiments, we exposed nematodes to a commonly used fungicide called mancozeb. Mancozeb has been linked in a recent study coming out of Spain to Parkinsonism in agricultural workers and in families that live near farms in Spain. And so what we discovered when we applied mancozeb to our nematodes is we discovered that nematodes have a really hard time making the transition from crawling to swimming. They can't make that transition if they've been exposed to this fungicide, whereas they can go from swimming to crawling. And so we were really interested in this. Why this specific behavioral deficit? It turns out that dopamine neurons are the kinds of cells that control that transition from swimming to crawling. And it turns out that those dopamine neurons are damaged permanently. They exhibit neurodegenerative change in response to exposure to mancozeb. And so here we see that these nematodes are exhibiting the same kind of neural damage that we see with Parkinsonism in humans. My second short story is about how pesticides affect reproduction. And in this study we are just now publishing, this is in collaboration with a colleague of mine at Marist College and our students. The pesticide that we were looking at, we just went to Lowe's and picked it up off the shelf. It's called Tree and Shrub. I don't recommend it. Tree and Shrub has the active ingredient imidacloprid, which I know is a big mouthful, but it's the kind of pesticide that has been linked to honeybee disorder and colony collapse. So we were really interested in the effects of this mixture, Tree and Shrub, on nematode reproduction. We established that this pesticide also affects behaviors like locomotion, the ability of the worms to move, and it also shows damage to the neurons that regulate that locomotion. So that kind of story is still there. But my colleague at Marist also discovered that in response to this pesticide exposure, the nematodes cannot lay as many eggs. Those eggs that they lay grow up into worms that look okay, but it turns out those worms, the offspring, the next generation, have difficulty reproducing. And so what we have shown, which is very exciting but scary, is that this pesticide mixture can lead to transgenerational effects on the reproduction of these nematodes. The third story has a happy ending. In this story, this was in collaboration with scientists at the University of Rome and the University of Prague, in collaboration with Miriam Rossi in the chemistry department and her husband Franco Caruso. And in this story, we exposed nematodes to the pesticide paraquat, which is an agent that's been used in warfare in the Vietnam War. And this particular pesticide causes oxidative damage. It can damage cells kind of non-specifically by generating free radicals. Miriam and Franco are very interested in the antioxidant properties of olive oil, the health benefits provided by olive oil as part of a Mediterranean diet. And so in this study that we did together, we showed that worms, nematodes that grow up in a particular olive oil that's raised and grown at the University of Rome can give these nematodes a longer life. They live longer if they're ingesting this olive oil. This olive oil contains particular antioxidant chemicals, it turns out, can block the damaging effects of paraquat. Very exciting, happy ending that components of our diet can help alleviate perhaps some damage caused by pesticide residues. And I was going to give you 3 stories, but I'm giving you a bonus story now. And in this story, this was some work that I did in collaboration with a lab in Shanghai at East China Normal University. And in this study, most of the work was carried out by the graduate students in Defu He's lab at East China Normal University. And they exposed zebrafish as well as nematodes to microplastic particles. These particles are microscopic, you can't see them. They're the result of plastics that have degraded over time by being, tumbled in the waters, buried in the soil for long periods of time, exposed to UV light. The plastic never goes away, the particles just get smaller and smaller. And in this study, what we showed was that exposing nematodes to these microplastic particles, they ingest them, just like we do, and those particles cause damage to the reproductive and intestinal systems in both zebrafish and C. elegans. So those are my 4 stories that I've shared with you, and I hope that I've impressed upon you the value of studying these sorts of things in a tiny worm and the lessons this tiny worm can give us about the effects of our pesticides and plastics on our own health. And this very last slide shows the collaborators that I worked with over the years for these projects, including Janet Gray in the Psychological Science Department, who retired a little while ago, Paula Cecchi at Marist College, Miriam and Franco, as I mentioned, and all of our students. It's a really large number of students, as well as the lab at East China Normal. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed this talk.